I'm Pastor Ray Jones, and this is Genesis to Revelation. Well, this week you'll notice that I am dressed in a more casual attire. I'm sporting my Patriots garb on, as it is the NFL draft weekend, and the Patriots have drafted an offensive lineman in the first round to protect their young quarterback Drake May. So I'm excited about the future for the Patriots, even though we are well past the glory of our Tom Brady years with our 6 Super Bowl trophies and all of that. But nonetheless, to just have a little fun, I wanted to reflect on just some cultural aspect of we live in a time where there's much going on, and as Christians, we will participate in a culture and enjoy things of the culture, and sports, for me, is one of those things that I enjoy and support my team in following them. In our last episode, we covered up to David's entrance into Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Here we find ourselves beginning in 2 Samuel 7, all the way to the end of his life, essentially. And so what you're going to notice, as we are following a chronological reading program rather than a canonical reading program, you may notice that we're going back and forth. We're going from 2 Samuel to 1 Chronicles to assorted Psalms in the life of David. And that can be a little hard to follow. Some of it may seem redundant because you almost find word for word renderings of the life of David in the 2 different accounts from Samuel to Chronicles, and even some overlap between what you find in the Psalms with what you find in the life of David. So I want to interact with that. It is not redundant. So if you want to compare these 3 different books of the Bible and how they tell the story of David, it's not unlike what we find in the New Testament with the life of Jesus, where we have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with these 4 Gospels and these different reflections. In those cases, some of them are eyewitness, some of them are the stories of the eyewitnesses mediated through another writer who himself was not an eyewitness. And especially with the Gospel of John, you've got a very theological reflection on Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. Well, the same being here with David's life, obviously told much earlier in history, but also much earlier in the canonical ordering of the Scriptures. And so there are different theological purposes that the writer of Samuel has versus the writer of Chronicles has. So that is important. When you see these episodes side by side, you'll find sometimes that the book of Chronicles doesn't necessarily capture the negative stories of David, or they're not as condemning of David, say, in what we find in Samuel. And so Samuel is more the rendering of David's life as it leads to captivity, as the baton is passed from subsequent generation of David's descendants, which we'll interact with in later episodes. But the book of Chronicles is written from the perspective of the exiles after they've come back from their captivity, after the fall of David's dynasty, the destruction of the temple, and their humiliation and just existential crisis as a people as they are there in Babylon. Now they've come back multiple generations later. They're rebuilding the city, they're rebuilt the temple, and then there's this reflection. And the book of Chronicles is capturing a hopeful picture that God is being faithful to the promises of David in his line, that there will be a future king who will bring the promises that God makes to David in his dynasty there in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So that is important for you as you read this to reflect on the fact that these stories of David are told at different times in Israel's history, and they have a different theological purpose. Now, the thing with the book of Psalms is that you're getting, in many cases, first-person accounts of David as he reflects on the different episodes of his life. And so his pain and his suffering, but also his deep faith. And so that's one of the things that is a struggle, is how are we to read the life of David? A man who is chosen because Saul is rejected. We're told that David possesses a heart after God's own heart. And as you read the life of David, it's all ascending, 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 and then we have his fall that comes with his sin with Bathsheba. And it's just hard to render. How does a man who possesses a heart after God's own heart, how can he commit such great sin? How can he take the wife of one of his loyal soldiers, and not only take his wife, impregnate her, call him from battle, seek to get him drunk so that he'll go home and sleep with his wife and David's sin can be covered? And when Uriah has shown to be a more faithful and loyal soldier than David is, more faithful to God, that he will not go home while his men are on the field of battle, the David puts the orders for Uriah's death in his hands, and he takes them to Joab to the field of battle, where he is put on the front lines to ensure his death. Once Uriah is dead, David allows for a period of time for Bathsheba to mourn. Then she comes to be his wife. She has the baby. Nobody except those in David's inner circles would know these things. The public is unaware of this, but there's a statement in Samuel's account. The thing that David did displeased the Lord. It didn't escape God's notice. And so here, on one level, we see how David is chosen versus Saul, who's rejected. When Nathan confronts David with this soul-stirring parable, where you see David's righteous indignation and his sense of justice rise up. And he says, this man deserves to die. And then Nathan, in that prophetic voice, says, you are the man. David's response is, I have sinned. That's where you see the contrast between Saul, who makes his excuses, and David, who owns his sin, albeit late and albeit with devastating consequences, because from this time on, we just see the upheaval. 4 of David's sons will die, the baby, and then we're going to see his son Amnon die because he commits rape with his half-sister Tamar, and her brother Absalom gets his vengeance because David doesn't deal with it, and then Absalom has a conspiracy because David seems to be this unjust and absent father, and he steals the heart of God's people. And once again, we see David fleeing his enemy. So he's fleeing his son Absalom, similarly to the way he fled Saul. And so we see this in the Psalms that are depicted. Once again, the suffering servant. Once again, though, we see David entrusting his future into God's hands. He acts very faithfully even as he's fleeing for his life. So you see, David is a complicated figure. But even at the end, where he takes the census, which is a sin against God, where he's trusting in a standing army rather than in God. And even this complicated figure of Joab is calling this out to David. and saying, should we be doing this? And David nonetheless does it. And God brings judgment upon the nation because of David's sin. And once again, what's interesting in this is you see David seeking to act as a mediator. Now, he's the one who's caused the sin upon his nation, but he acts as a mediator between his people and God and is willing to sacrifice himself in that regard there with the building of this altar on the future Temple Mount. So there's a lot of things going on of great theology, but also in the biblical storyline that will be developed and culminate ultimately in Jesus's life as David's descendant. So we see, once again, this idea of David being a type. He is a type of Christ, where we see one who has a heart after God's own heart. He's a king, he's a priest, he's a prophet, and he's one who will seek to mediate on behalf of his people in a sacrificial way. And yet we see his imperfections, and thus the reason there needs to be an even greater Son of David who can do this sinlessly and flawlessly. So as you're reading through the life of David, these might be things that you're wrestling with, struggling with, trying to reconcile these different pictures of David. And he's indeed a complicated person. And yet, if you think about Abraham, you have Abraham and you have David, who are these two huge figures, and you could, of course, include Moses in that. These huge figures in Israel's story who have great faith, and yet they are deeply flawed. And that's one of the beautiful things as you read through the scriptures that I think allows us to be able to connect with the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament. But I would add to that also the disciples of Jesus as well, that we see their humanity. We see their imperfections, and that God is still working with that. And I think it is important. Think about this, the gracious nature of God. Who becomes David's successor? It's Solomon, is it not? And who is Solomon's mother? Bathsheba. That's incredible. That is incredible that the very woman that David committed his greatest act of sins with. Now, she's the innocent party, and I think that's important to note as we read that, especially through a 21st century post-Me Too movement, that we can't help but read these texts and struggle with them in our different cultural moment. However, I think it's important to realize, look at this, that God in his graciousness still is working in the lives, in the brokenness of very dysfunctional and difficult relationships to accomplish his purposes. So I think that's something really important to reflect on as we read the life of David. So I hope this will help you as you negotiate this really remarkable figure in Scripture. He's certainly one of the most important in the Bible storyline, especially as it's pointing to the most important being Jesus of Nazareth, who is ultimately God in human flesh, the ultimate King. I commend you as you read God's Word this week. May you be blessed and grow in your faith as a result of it.